Hey there, so we're going to deep dive into a data set ourselves and have a look at how you could ask some questions about that data and start to think a little scientifically. You need to get your head around this data. So I've opened up here, as you can see, the first file set, pollen, file 1, pollen counts. So let's try and get our head around this. We've got an orchard letter code, a pear letter code. Geez, I better go and read that again and work out what that was about. I've got a distance class, so they haven't given me the number of kilometres, just whether it's near or far. I might have to do something smart with that before I can actually start to understand it. The time, presumably the time of day, and a time class, which looks like, if that's 9:30, that's kind of early morning, 11:20 is kind of mid-morning, 1:20 is early afternoon, 3:30 is late afternoon, and then it starts again, you know, on the ones that are far away. So it looks like we've divided our time into 4 classes, 1, 2, 3, 4, early morning, mid-morning, early afternoon, late afternoon. The number of anthers on each flower. Now, if you don't know what anthers are, then you're going to need to understand that to understand how to even ask questions about this. And pollen, hopefully you do know what's doing. Pollen per flower, there's my pollen per flower counts. So here's a question I'm going to ask of the data, just an initial question, and that is, how is the pollen count related to the number of anthers in the flower? Very simply, I'm just going to click on, you see I'm clicking on the letter F here, not trying to select the data, it goes down forever. I'm going to hold down the command key and click on the next column, and then now I use the command key, not the shift key, and you'll see a little bit later why that was important. So now I'm going to just have a quick look, always an XY scatter plot in science, always an XY scatter plot. And look at this, isn't this interesting? So how would you describe the relationship between the number of anthers on the flower on the x-axis and the amount of pollen found in each flower? Well, hopefully you've kind of seen that the maximum amount of pollen is definitely related to number of anthers, which sort of makes sense anatomically if you know what an anther actually is. If not, pause this video and go and find out. But it doesn't really affect the total amount of pollen per flower. But we could do something clever with this. If we're worried about flowers that have only got a fewer anthers on them, and that can affect the maximum amount they could have, we could, of course, very interestingly, create another whole column here, which could be the pollen per anther. Okay. And simply, we're just going to divide the amount of pollen divided by the number of anthers in the flower. And then I've got my formula. Now there's lots of data, so I'm going to hold down the command key, press the down arrow, go to the bottom of the data. It's 950 rows down. That's why I'm not going to scroll. I'm just way too lazy for that. I'm going to put a place marker there, an X, hold down Command Shift, head all the way back up again, Command Shift and up arrow, selects all of the data from that formula, and then Command D to fill that down. And now I've got this lovely formula on pollen per anther. So I don't really care whether the flower's got lots of anthers or only a few anthers. We've now controlled for the number of anthers in the data. That's a smart thing to do. Okay. Then we can ask another question. How does the time of day affect the amount of pollen that we find on a flower? And I'm hoping you're already thinking you know how to go about doing that. How would you go about finding how the time of day affects the pollen count? Well, let's have a look at the time of day because it's interesting. It's in AM/PM time, which is not terribly helpful for us. So if we just graph this 1.2, Excel would think that 1.2 comes before 9.3, which it does, except 9:30 in the morning does come before 1:20 in the afternoon. So that's not going to work. But we could certainly have a look at the time class there because that will go numerically, mid-morning, early morning, mid-morning, etc. So I'm going to use that one. Personally, if I had time, I'd actually turn this into a 24-hour time thing because that'd give me better resolution. But I'm going to do that, and I'm going to graph it against the pollen per anther. So now I'm not worried about whether we're talking about a flower with lots of anthers or a flower with a few anthers. Insert an XY scatter plot, and okay, that's interesting. It actually doesn't seem that there's all that much of a correlation there between the time of day and actually the amount of pollen per anther. Of course, to answer that question properly, we're going to need to use some stats. I'm going to have to learn those stats a little bit later on. But for here and now, we can say that that doesn't make a whole lot of difference. So we've now asked ourselves a couple of questions on this data set. We've interrogated it. We've actually got ourselves a kind of a rough, rule of thumb answer to those. There's still some questions you could ask of this data set. And if you open up the other two files in this data set, you could ask some questions of some of the other files as well. Spend some time, think about a question that you'd like to ask. Think smart about the question. Make sure you understand the anatomy of the flower and the way the experiment was done. And have a go at putting together a report on the question that you went out, set out to find an answer to, and ballpark when you did it, how you did it, and what was the answer that you got from that data set.